And so I'm sure we'll have additional folks joining us shortly, but we have a very full program today, so I'd like to get us started. My name is Christian Osterman. I direct European Studies here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, have for many years run the Cold War International History Project, and I'm very delighted to welcome you all to the Wilson Center. The center is pleased to co-sponsor this conference on the promises of 1968, and it's wonderful to see a number of old friends here joining us at the center. For those of you who are not familiar with the center, in particular those who may be watching us via live webcast today, let me just mention that the center, founded in the pivotal year that we are talking about, 1968, is the official U.S. memorial to Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States, as both a distinguished scholar, in fact, I think still the only American president with a PhD, and a national leader. Wilson felt strongly that the scholar and the policymaker were engaged in a common enterprise. Here at the center, we commemorate the ideals and concerns of Woodrow Wilson by providing a link between the world of ideas and the world of policy, by fostering research, study, discussion, and collaboration among a full spectrum of individuals concerned with policy and scholarship in national and world affairs. Directed by former Congressman Lee Hamilton, the center hosts about 150 scholars each year and holds over 700 meetings on international and national affairs. Before I introduce this morning's keynote speaker, Professor Charles Mayer, let me thank just briefly a few people who have made this meeting possible. Of course, my co-conveners, Vladimir Tismanianu and Oria Patapievici, director of the Romanian Cultural Institute, with whom this is the second in a series of at least 3 conferences on critical events and episodes such as 1968. Let me also thank Ambassador Viorita and the Romanian Embassy for hosting this event, the Center for the Study of Post-Communist Societies at the University of Maryland, and Georgetown University's Center for European Studies for collaborating on this event. None of these events would be possible without the hard work at so many levels by a number of people, including Bogdan Jakob, whom most of you have already met. I'd also like to thank my colleague Mircea Munteanu, Christina Terțieva, and Tim McDonnell here at the center. Now it's a great privilege to introduce you to an old friend of the center and one of the giants in our field, Charlie Mayer. He is the Leverett Saltonstall Professor of History at Harvard University. For many years directed the Center for European Studies there. He is most recently the author of Among Empires, American Ascendancy and Its Predecessors. Earlier books include Dissolution, The Crisis of Communism and the End of East Germany, The Unmasterable Past, History, Holocaust, and German National Identity, In Search of Stability, Explorations in Historical Political Economy, and Recasting Bourgeois Europe, a classic by now, which is in at least its 2nd edition at this point. He has also edited several collaborative volumes and has written a host of articles, too long of a list to present you here in detail. Let me just say that among Charlie's many, many honors and prizes are the 2004 Humboldt Prize, given to him in Berlin, and a fellowship a number of years ago here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and so it's a great pleasure to welcome you back, Charlie. You have the floor.
Thank you.
Can either sit or...
I'll read it, I guess.
It is a pleasure to be back. I was a fellow in the spring of '89 at the old castle, which had its charms, and it was a wonderful experience. I would be thanking all the people that Christian read off, and the Romanian names do not come trippingly to my tongue, so I will thank you collectively. It was Vladimir who suggested I do this. It's been fun. I've met new friends and had a chance for some great conversations at both the Czech and the Romanian ambassadors, and that's the best part of these conferences. So it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be back. I've called this talk East, West, North, South, 1968 in context. But I'm going to ask you to start by thinking back further, 60 years ago, and 20 years before the events of 1968, historians commemorated the 100th anniversary of the revolutions of 1848. Recall the wave of upheavals that had gripped continental Europe from February of that year through the spring of 1849. Demonstrations in Palermo spread to Naples, Rome, and the north of Italy, even more quickly to Paris, Baden, Berlin, Vienna, Prague, Budapest, the salons of Poland, and even some of the salons of Petersburg. Rulers made concessions, ceded constitutions, or even abdicated. The ancient Metternich fled to London, his supposed system, that was the term also then, discredited. But then the radicals divided. The authorities in Central Europe, the monarchs recovered their nerve and slowly suppressed the would-be revolutionaries in one city after another. They did not stint on soldiers nor on shooting and hanging. And when in Eastern Europe it looked as if the revolution might successfully revive in Hungary, in the spring of 1849, the Russians intervened to suppress the uprising. The revolutionary wave of 1848-49 smashed against the granite breakwater of the Tsar's empire, and Russian soldiers marched into East Central Europe to wipe out resistance and punish those who resisted. 21 years later, however, in 1870, Russia's leaders would stand aside and allow the Germans to unify their country without opposition. Maybe it sounds familiar. The overall interpretation of the upheavals that had gripped almost all of Europe in 1848 and excited radicals and Democrats everywhere was that they had failed. One of the titles that summed up the prevailing wisdom in 1948 was that 1848 had been a turning point that had failed to turn. Marx and Engels, in fact, had dwelt on the reasons for failure in their contemporary interpretations on German and French events, revolution and counter-revolution, articles published as a book, and the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. The question of failure has always remained dominant for historians, more so than that of origins. Indeed, the trope of failure has been so prevalent that it often obscures what the experiences of 1848 did manage to achieve. Heightened national consciousness, a national parliamentary prototype in Germany, the advent of constitutional monarchy with parliaments in Prussia and Piedmont, the end of inherited monarchy in France, and the final abolition of serfdom in Austria. The revolutions of 1848, of course, bear some intriguing superficial resemblances to the upheavals during and around 1968. They were intensely contagious phenomena, with rebels in one society rapidly learning from those in others. They incorporated diverse and often contending ideological visions: nationalist, liberal and elitist, democratic, socialist, ethnically populist, visions whose adherents briefly converged and then went their separate ways. And their brief year or half year of relative success soon gave way to collapse, repression, reaction, and often on the part of those who took part as enthusiastic youth, later repentance. Social Darwinist materialism or realism allegedly replaced romanticism. One-time radicals became sober statesmen. As of 1948, the revolutions of 1848 seem to have come and gone. a youthful romantic fling after which the protagonists had settled down to far more stable and, alas, sometimes unhappy marriages. Now, this may not be our assessment of 1968, 40 years after the events. I wonder whether it might be so in 2068, in another 60 years. Will 1968 seem a brief manifestation of late adolescent political hormones that left memories, friendships, ideas, those often generated throughout the 1960s or longer, but little institutional legacy? In fact, to judge from the papers, just from the papers discussed at this conference, it is my sense that we have not made failure, and why failure, so obsessive a historical theme. Outside of Czechoslovakia, we don't usually find failure the appropriate term for the dissipation of protest in 1968. And we do know why the transformation of Czechoslovakia failed. It failed because of another Russian intervention in East Central Europe. Now, the absence of failure as a major question should be encouraging news. But in fact, the reason that historians don't foreground the question of eventual failure is because there was no conventional success. Whereas the revolutionaries of 1848 compelled their rulers to liberalize their governments or substituted other rulers, even if only for a few months, the radicals of 1968 did not prevail, even as briefly as the demonstrators and revolutionaries of 1848. In Paris, Berlin, Turin, and Mexico City, protesting students in 1968 may have aspired to regime change. Nonetheless, they targeted generally their this is outside of Czechoslovakia now. I'm talking about the, I won't say the West, but non-Czech areas and Western Europe and Latin America. They targeted radicals targeted their universities and not their ministries, convinced that the university served as the key institution for reproducing a bureaucratic capitalism as they saw as the source of repression. The Marxist concept of reproduction really comes into its own in this period, and it would repay closer study. I give you a citation from one of the major chronicles of the French agitation by Hervé Hamon and Serge Rotman. If at the beginning of the 1960s the brain of a perverse sociologist had imagined some sort of geometric place where all the contradictions of Gaullist France converged, the site of the new University of Nanterre would easily have served him. On a microcosm of a few hectares, there existed side by side the modern and the obsolete, opulence and poverty, the sinister gates of the low-rent HLM developments, the monstrous trenches being dug for the RER, the metro of tomorrow, the shanty towns that had formerly been bastions of the Algerian FLN, and lost in this debauchery of industrial hangars and rail lines, the sanctuary where the spirit breathed and science triumphed. Essentially, this is what Dick Howard told us he encountered when he spoke yesterday. Now, this is not to say, the focus on the university, that student leaders did not dream revolution must somehow follow the assault on the university and their massive mobilization. Again, Hamon and Rotman describe how even at the very moment that the communists, the French Communist Party, was already backing away from the May movement, student leaders believed that wildcat strikes would escape the party's dead hand and that they could achieve the seizure of power. They made preparations to march from the left bank to the right bank, to take the city hall, perhaps even the Ministry of Finances. They remembered Stanley Kubrick's film Spartacus. La fête est finie, on passe à l'offensive. They apparently did end up torching the Bourse, but French capitalism hardly halted. The French believed in the Grande Journée and the theater of revolution. But hypnotized perhaps by the theatrical, they took for granted their new lieux de mémoire even before they had seized them. That is why the major question about 1968, I think, is not why revolution failed, because revolution hardly began. Instead, I believe reckoning with 1968 means addressing two other questions. One is that of significance. This is not an issue of explanation, strictly speaking, but of interpretation. It is the so what question, and the answers must remain subjective. What did the protests of 1968 amount to? What did the protesters want? Were they important? How should we evaluate them? The question is not in the first instance why the events took place, nor why they ended, but whether they really mattered. Of course, there is a huge literature on 1968, and I do not claim to have mastered even a small part of it. Often, the works assume that 1968 transformed society. Even the very solid collection of essays, just to take a sample, put out by the German Historical Institute a decade ago, assumes that a new world was ushered in. The volume remains a wonderful resource, even if its authors sometimes take the benevolence of the protagonists for granted. This is, in fact, a general challenge presented by the literature on 68. Too often it recites the proclaimed goals of participatory democracy as self-evidently progressive and devoutly to have been wished. It forgives, indeed often omits, the posturing and the illusions. I don't want to attempt a moral history or an ethical evaluation of 68 in the West. Jeffrey Herf raised some questions about this yesterday, but I do recognize it as a serious inquiry that is often compelling for those who took part. And I do want to try to assess significance and importance, and it's not because I believe that if there is a world historical significance, it is just the triumph of barbarism. Not that barbarian triumphs are devoid of significance. Those of us who lived through the events will recall, and I will tell to you, Alex Gerschenkron's parable in 1969, The Most Wonderful Thing. Alex Gerschenkron was an eminent professor of economic history, born in Odessa, educated in Germany in the 20s, wonderful professor, and along with many of my other colleagues, I remember this period from the university, immensely disturbed by these events. Adam Ulam, whose name will be familiar to all of you, once said to me as we were crossing the yard, "It's impossible to teach under these conditions. We should just close the university." Actually, I did not think so, but this was the attitude. Gerschenkron told this story in the faculty meeting and brought the faculty meeting to silence. It was like a Hans Christian Andersen story about a man who made a wonderful clock for the king. It did everything like with its, singing nightingales along. And the king said, "This is the most wonderful thing." And then in strode a barbarian with a large hammer and smashed the clock, this is Gerschenkron's story, and said, "This is the most wonderful thing." Well, people were, it was very dramatically done. My admiration for it was a little diminished when I heard on the radio the same talk given verbatim at other campuses. But this was after all one interpretation, the triumph of the barbarians with hammers. So it is not, though, what I am trying to get at with significance, although that would be significant. Significance, moreover, is not the only question. The other one that is preoccupying demands causal explanation and not merely interpretation. It is why the manifestations of 1968 were so widespread. What factors created a worldwide movement? 1968 saw explosions in Western Europe, Communist Eastern Europe, English-speaking North America, Mexico and South America, and parts of Asia and Africa. Were these outbreaks manifestations of one underlying set of discontents, or just separate protests that gathered strength from their simultaneity? Many of my colleagues would say, in fact, that there was no single radical movement in 1968, that whereas the East European events were heroic and for real, the protest movements of Western students were misconceived, childish, and destructive. When I'm feeling irreverent sometime with my students, I refer to Prague Spring and Frog Spring, the one serious and moving, the other posturing and narcissistic. Nonetheless, can we not impute some underlying causes of turbulence to all the contested locations of 1968? If so, we will also be on our way to addressing the issue of significance. So the meaning of it all and the relative ubiquity of protest are the two questions to which I want to attempt a response. We usually judge the importance of a historical event in terms of what followed, what came later. The search for significance entails trend spotting, that which is revealed in the course of subsequent developments. To be important or significant is to be pregnant with the future. Now, it is possible to argue that 1968 was pregnant with 1989, just as we might argue that 1848 had been pregnant with 1870. In his remarkable account, A Tale of Two Utopias, Paul Berman, who will speak later, writes that 1968's invisible aftermath was all the while going on. Whereas 1870s, that's the end of the quote, whereas 1870s movers and shakers had decided to come to terms with blood and iron, 1989's revolutionaries had decided to accept liberal democracy and American support. A new liberal and realistic left emerged. Children of 1968, sometimes even participants, but sobered up, apparently, as they became adults. Havel and Michnik, Berman reminds us, quote, turned out to be the same heroic persons, but now adult liberals. But it is also appropriate to seek significance in the magnitude and extent of causation. That is, not in what follows, but what preceded. If all the upheavals of 1968 can be understood as responses to an underlying set of discontents, then something important about underlying conditions will emerge. When earthquakes and volcanic eruptions take place along a geological fault line, whether in the Adriatic or underneath California's mountain ridges, or where the Indian Ocean laps at western Indonesia, we sense that the crust of the earth is inexorably shifting underfoot, even if we don't feel it, except at the moment of quake and eruption. Of course, we could argue that the manifestations of 1968 erupted just as a bunch of coincidences. To my mind, this stretches credulity. Big effects, I believe, call for big causes. Or we could find it the result of sociocultural contagion, as one group of young radicals just learned from another. The 60s, after all, the long 60s, had brought many precedents for collective action. The massive Tokyo demonstrations against the U.S. Security Pact at the beginning of the decade, when Vice President Nixon had visited. The Aldermaston March for Nuclear Disarmament, organized by the CND. I remember seeing Bertrand Russell sitting in Parliamentary Square at the climax of that march. Martin Luther King's civil rights marches, the Watts rioting in 1963, and then within the University Berkeley's free speech movement in 1964, a perhaps farce following on tragedy, and the growing protests against the Vietnam War, recruitment by the military or by the Dow Chemical Company, etc., etc. But I still believe if we want to comprehend not just student radicalization, but the broader reform efforts, both in Eastern Europe, in Czechoslovakia, and the more muffled manifestations in Poland and elsewhere in Eastern Europe, as well as the West, the diffusion of a repertory will not suffice. The repertory was often different. Flashback briefly once again to 1848. We know that contagion was important. Revolution began in mid-February, and within 10 days it had engulfed Paris, and within another month, Central Europe. This in an era before radio or television or cassette tape players or mobile phones. Students and frustrated opposition leaders took heart from initial successes. But if contagion helps, or diffusion helps account for the common format of protest, both in 1848 and 1968, it isn't adequate to explain underlying causation in either year. In 1848, we can discern a deep-seated discontent with residual authoritarian regimes. In 1848, a new generation of 19th century professionals and students felt that they were locked into authoritarian structures designed at the Congress of Vienna over 30 years earlier. A common agenda of nationalist and liberal aspirations gripped the political classes of the 1840s. Discontent, moreover, found a far wider echo because of the bleak economic conditions of the 1840s. As a European series of events, 1848 is not so hard to explain. The harder question about the 1840s is whether the upheavals in China and East Asia also had some underlying common roots. Did the Taiping uprisings in China, with its monumental loss of life, emerge from the same similar underlying pressures as revolution in Europe? This is not an easy question. It's not usually posed, and I can't take it up here. But we have these crises in late Tokugawa Japan, China, soon in religious revivals in the Central Asia and the Middle East. And once we widen our perspective in the 1840s and 1848 to include Asian and African events, just as in 1968, we are asking what forces shape global history. And herein lies the real significance of such a broad movement, even if its results seem insubstantial. It serves to reveal the seismic pressures of an epoch. It serves to clue us to what's happening on the San Andreas Fault or in the areas that will generate tsunamis in the Indian Ocean. But what are the pressures in 1968 if this is the case? What sort of epoch was it? As historians, moreover, I would say we should be prodded to reflection just because we are currently living through a series of international economic developments that may or may not testify to a crisis of market capitalism and to a political event that may signal a profound new departure. We realize that in our own globalized world, no matter how profound or merely transitory the recent economic difficulties, we are linked and profoundly intertwined. The ground has trembled a little beneath our own feet, and it further drives home the question, to what degree were global mechanisms at stake 40 years ago in 1968? Of course, there was a revolutionary repertory that was widely copied, which involved radical demands, formal petitions, the so-called pliego petitorio in Mexico City, the 8 demands at Harvard, and clashes with police or soldiers. The 1967 demonstration against the Shah's visit in Berlin produced an early student martyr, Benno Ohnesorg. The so-called Battle of the Valle Giulia, followed in Rome in March 1968. Clashes took place in Addis Ababa, Cairo, Calcutta. Huge demonstrations took place to protest police action against students at the Zocalo in Mexico City in July and August, followed by the brutal assault at Tlatelolco on October 2nd, which left perhaps 300 students dead. Colombia's turmoil in 1968, which bitterly divided faculty, and you can see there are unpublished documents where faculty were really angry with each other. This was followed a year later at Harvard, where students were summoned to, quote, this is one I always liked, strike because they're squeezing the life out of you, unquote, with sit-ins, barricades, smashed window, and that is conduct designed, at least on the part of the left, the far left, to provoke police action that would polarize the university. The search for violent confrontation in 1968, even if only by a small minority, represents, I think, an important difference from 1989, when mass demonstrations aspired to achieving concessions without violence. This is I studied Leipzig and elsewhere, and 1989 had a different strategy. But as in 1968, it was assumed violence in the university would ignite revolution in the wider society. Now, in posing the issue of geographical spread, I'm provoked to a degree by the forum articles in the most recent American Historical Review, which commemorates the publication 50 years ago of the volume on the general crisis of the 17th century. You'll remember this historical discussion. Jonathan Dewald's comment in the recent pieces makes the case with respect to the 17th century for downplaying the idea of a general crisis and the notion of an underlying mechanism. He argues first that historians, quote, have become skeptical about linkages among politics, culture, social relations, and economic practices, which he deems a retreat from structuralism. He thinks, with respect to the mechanisms adduced for the 17th century, a vision of general crisis has to be replaced with multiple crises governed by highly specific logics. Now, Dewald is a very good historian of the Ancien Regime, and of course, we can, as good historians, we always demonstrate that each sequence of events is unique. Many of us choose the discipline of history because temperamentally we treasure what is different and not what reveals general trends. As historians, we revel in particularity. And it is easy enough to show, whether for 1848 or 1968, that every society faced its own particular difficulties and challenges. In this view, the protests were united only by a sort of competitive dramaturgy, and even in that respect, they varied between Prague and the West. Of course, this is true. Let me be provocative and argue that particularity is a trivial finding. It stares us in the face all the time. This doesn't mean that historians don't win insights from patiently setting out how developments were particular, how they differed from each other. But just to announce their uniqueness does not take us very far. And abandoning the traditional call for differentiation, I want to revert to the search for a common logic, a common challenge for the societies that went into the events of 1968, even when the societies were on opposite sides of the great communist-capitalist divide. Whether looking forward or backward, many of us have responded at least implicitly to the accusations that whereas 1968 in Eastern Europe was for earnest and for real, in the West 1968 was just a manifestation by spoiled kids. It would be perhaps satisfying if we could simply take the Czech experiment as deeply serious and ultimately tragic, and dismiss the Western country's agitation as the unworthy acting out on the part of pampered, wealthy children. Raymond Aron, a great social analyst, essentially retreated into this approach, as did my colleagues Adam Ulam and Alex Gerschenkron. Such an evaluation, of course, allows us to contrast the heroism of Prague with the destructive self-indulgence of the Sorbonne or Columbia or later Harvard. And the other problem is that even if we infer some underlying so-called structural causes, it doesn't mean that they really existed. I realize that many good historians will say the notion of some structural causality is a legacy, an obsolete legacy of Marxism or positivism, that history is no more than events or interpretations, one damned thing or one damned interpretation after another, and looking for underlying causality is just to follow an illusion. Relatedly, but I will propose an underlying historical logic, not just a traveling theater of protest. Relatedly, I do want to argue for the significance of 68, but not significance in terms of aftermath again, not because 68 was pregnant with the future. Everything is always pregnant with the future, but significance as a measure of the stresses of post-war society that I believe powerfully contributed to the eruptions. No one can determine whether 68 brought changes that would not otherwise have come about given the momentum of the long preceding decade. My metaphor, again, is that of the earthquake. What we learn from a tremor high on the Richter scale is not when future earthquakes will occur, but what gigantic seismic stresses had already accumulated before the slippages of Earth's tectonic plates against each other. Of course, 1968 would have consequences, although different from what its activists hoped for. But what I believe that what 1968 teaches most validly is the nature of global development in the 20 preceding years. In this conviction, as I said, my enterprise differs from those who have sought to see 68 as a harbinger or an originator of the future. Paul Berman, who will speak later, has written a wonderful book, A Tale of Two Utopias, based on this premise. I cannot provide the same intimate knowledge of the American left, neither can I draw on the detailed knowledge of Eastern Europe that so many of the participants at this conference possess and which they have been presenting here. Still, I'm attempting something different. From Paul Berman's perspective, world history was being made by students and, quote, there was, as everyone recognized at the time, a common theme. It was the split between the young and the old, unquote. He follows in particular the American student left, the battles of students for a democratic society with the arcane remnants of the anti-communist socialist left in New York, those survivors of the battles against Stalinism in the 1930s, which he describes variously as grizzled or gnarled. Paul's history, one might say, is a phenomenological account of the generation that went from 68 to 89, an account based on their perceived and lived experiences. It is a history from within. And by calling it a history from within, I don't mean to patronizing. For his chapter on Eastern Europe, Zappa and Havel is perhaps even more brilliant than his recollection of old and new left in the United States. And it provides a story of how the Czechs got from the Prague Spring via Václav Havel, smoky little theaters, imports of rock music, and the plastic people of the universe to Charter 77 and the fall of 1989. So I prepared for this by listening to my old CD of Marta Kubishova singing Hey Jude in Czech. In any case, I certainly can't compete with this account. I wasn't within. I don't say that as a virtue, just as a fact. I was already married with 2 new children and didn't have the temperament, although I had a few students who were involved, and I tried to be generous with them, and many who sympathized. And I did have the book learning to teach students those years about George Orwell and the POUM and Barcelona in 1936, the arena where Soviet communist agents had crushed the anarcho-syndicalist alternative, a midpoint, so to speak, between Kronstadt and Prague in August 1968. And this was very important. They really wanted to learn all this. I did not despair of the university at that point. Berman's sort of life cycle history provides a redemptive tale for participants. Those who held youthful and naive Marxist convictions become ready in this account to exercise mature leadership along democratic lines. They will reaffirm liberalism, anti-communism, and recognize the clumsy virtues of America. By doing so, they overcome and atone for earlier silliness and even violence in 68. Ripeness is all. Interestingly enough, in Berman's account in Tim Rybak's History of Rock Around the Block, recently in Padraig Kenny's A Carnival of Revolution, 1989, music's Dionysian role plays a crucial role in 1979 and provides a major linkage from 68 to 89. The script might be called, to borrow from another philosopher of the Dionysian, the birth of liberty out of the spirit of music. And once again, the Dionysian arrives to confer a state of grace on the local bacchantes. It tends to suggest again that 1968 was not all bad, that it contained a search for fulfillment that had to undermine conformism, whether of the establishment or the old left in the West or the nomenclatura in the East. Still, a rock music history of the transit from 68 to 89 can only be a very partial story. No matter how groovy and fun it is, as Nietzsche himself told us, the Apollonian formative impulses also have to play a significant role, a constitutive role in creating drama. With maturity comes a scathing critique of the radical movements that memoirists such as Berman participated in, the critique of group conformity, repressiveness, sexism. And yet, retrospective wisdom, I think, in the life cycle approach, which is his, must still acknowledge the generosity of truth. I don't mean to diminish this sort of history from within, but I have a problem with life cycle history, the history that presupposes that somehow later stages redeem former stages. It is often memoir writ large. If we accept the legitimacy of this approach, I'm concerned lest we surrender social theory to biography. The perceived integrity of the personality through time seems to authenticate, indeed provide the model of social change and upheaval. The presumed decency of the retrospective narrator justifies to a degree the inevitable errors of youth. Becoming is all. Paul Berman has wrestled with this issue even more poignantly in his reflections on the career and passions of Joschka Fischer in his book Power and the Idealists. Now, youth versus age may explain Paris, Berlin, Columbia, and Harvard. Still, we must ask further, must go beyond personality. What was it about the world of the 50s and early 60s that produced such a reaction, that seemed so hostile to youth? What seemed so threatening to the generation of young people whom he endows with historical agency? It couldn't be simple repression, for the repression often followed and did not precede the provocations, at least in the West, and indeed was sometimes fervently sought by the demonstrators. Perhaps it was the fact that they were being prepared for a world without surprise and also without prospects, or exciting prospects. The vision they thought they were being offered was that of a gray on gray, and not Mitnick's beautiful gray, but the gray of the gray flannel suit. Good jobs, tolerance, social protection. In part, this attitude sprang from the post-war circumstances, all the privation of the war, but without the danger or the chance for heroism. The Weberian iron cage of instrumental rationality, of renunciation in the present for the better future, or a call to social discipline for the sake of post-war economic reconstruction and for the sake of the Cold War. Now, to the mass of young people in the post-war years, in the 50s as they went on, in the 60s, this probably was a vast improvement. Of course it was a vast improvement. People were not being killed, wealth was being created, growth was taking place. But to a significant number, it lacked, or at least for a while, it lacked transcendence, excitement, or mission. Whether under the auspices of multi-party alternation, as in the United States and in Western Europe, de facto single-party rule, as in Japan or in Mexico, or a one-party very tough sort of rule, as in Eastern Europe, both social systems seem to offer a dispiriting fusion of predictability and insecurity. Predictability in that a bureaucratized society would provide what was being called by one French sociologist, les héritiers, with a safe role as part of what another sociologist, Alain Touraine, would call the new class. Actually, les héritiers were in a slightly higher social position than the new class, but these were the analyses. And this was the security, insecurity, in that it offered no guarantee that they could enjoy more than this fonctionnaire future, that they could be more than just a cog. Post-Stalin, and this was some of the definition of the university, Clark Kerr's multiversity, that was designed to turn out the technocrats of the future. Post-Stalinist communism, I emphasize post-Stalinist, and the welfarist democracy of the West seemed to offer some of the same prospects, certainly at least to those who didn't have to live under real existing socialism. And this conclusion, while myopic, found serious people who argued for it, even in a way Raymond Aron and Daniel Bell, who saw so-called industrial society as an overarching epochal structure. Post-Stalinist communism flirted with the vision of a cybernetic future, of technocracy, as did the Western multiversity. We are not permitted to ask questions, Rudi Dutschke wrote at the time. We must accept the structure as it is, and thus as students and scientists we become more or less useful idiots within the system of profit maximization. The university became of interest because technical, and this is still Dutschke, and economic intelligence in advanced capitalism is more and more important for the reproduction of capital, the key concept of reproduction. Thus the whole problem of technocrats within automized industry. And so-called university reforms, he suggested, as did others, were just devices designed to shorten student time. Quote, the authoritarian society can no longer bring about reforms within itself in the radical meaning of real change. Reforms are only the refuge of the rulers who are concerned with stabilizing their positions. The revolution is not an event that takes 2 or 3 days in which there is shooting and hanging. It is a long, drawn-out process in which new people are created, capable of renovating society, so that revolution does not replace one elite with another, but creates a new anti-authoritarian structure with anti-authoritarian people. Well, this was Duchka, it could have been Marcuse, it could have been many of these protesters. And universities, nonetheless, in Duchka's critique, still offered the possibility of reflection. On the one hand, we can educate ourselves. This was the concept of the free university, which was discussed yesterday. And on the other hand, we always run the risk of educating ourselves for interests which are not our own, the interest of the rulers. We know that in the history of the universities, where this has become very clear, and is America's universities, and is now the pattern for science, which has become an instrument of American imperialism's direct machinery of destruction. Of course, it really wasn't just reflection that some of these students wanted. It was mobilization and direct action. The most beautiful day of my political life was the 1st of March, 1968, confessed an Italian student, Roberto Massari, referring to the Battle of the Valle Giulia in Rome that climaxed months of mobilization throughout Italian universities in pursuit of potere studentesco, and the call for a negative university that originated with the sociology students of Trento. Common to all these movements was a struggle for public space that was bound to become violent. That was the point of it. The student movement was the first in post-war history, Roberto Massari continues, that discovered the public space of streets and squares as a site of politics, developing there its own repertory of action, independently of the system of institutionalized politics. The historian Pierre Vidal-Naquet, who died, alas, too young, a few years ago, and who kept his psychic distance from this movement, admits he could never shout CRS equals SS. CRS were the French troops you saw coming out of their trucks with capes and clubs. He could not shout CRS equals SS because he remembered the SS. And he admitted that everything in this affair was symbolic, including the barricades. But that doesn't mean it was insignificant. In the Grande Journée, theater is life and has consequences. Bakunin and Rosa Luxemburg would have approved, perhaps not the Rosa whom the East Germans of 1988 cited when she called for freedom for those who think differently, but the Rosa of the mass strike. The classical, once revolutionary protagonist organized labor, of course, played an ambiguous role. Insofar as European unions remained under the control of the Communist Party, they participated in their movement, won their hefty wage increases in the Grenelle Agreement or from Italian entrepreneurs, and then backed away. In Italy, a strong current of autonomisti continued to make Italian industrial life an ongoing contest for factory power. I once spent a hellish train ride on the way from Paris to Rome in a hot July day train which couldn't proceed because the autonomisti controlled the signals and every few hours and never gave us enough time to go out on the beach, but never let us get to our destination. And these were not under union controls, obviously. Milan metalworkers revived the earlier dreams of factory councils emanating from the base, structures that had emerged briefly in each post-war period. Each society's radicals found a local enemy. In Germany, it was fascism, which through the specter of integration of Nazis still supposedly exerted a presence. Again, to cite Duchka, but it could be others, fascism is no longer structured and organized in one party or one person. The new fascism reveals itself through the organized authoritarian institutions in all parts of advanced capitalist society. And in the United States, it was racism and the war that served as the functional equivalent of latent fascism. To conclude or move toward conclusion, we can now contextualize the transnational or global meaning of 1968. The marches and demonstrations, the lurid and exaggerated diagnoses of imperialism and fascism, the thirst in some quarters, I admit a minority, for the paternalist mask of soft power to drop and reveal its repressive reality, in a sense to yearn for Darth Vader, these manifestations were not global just because they flared up in so many different sites across the world. They were global in that they arose as the first systemic challenge, I think, to what I'll call here the Yalta regime, erected after defeating Nazism, fascism, and Japanese military expansion. Ironically enough, the stability of both East and West did depend upon their reciprocal rivalry. The Cold War buckled both systems together in an agonistic relationship that claimed and justified immense collective psychopolitical energy in facing the system. Communism and democracy had defeated fascism. Now they confronted each other, and they imposed in the East, or they stabilized in the West, domestic regimes that made their reciprocal adversarial stance into respective ideological pillars. Ultimately, 68, I believe, testified to the fact that for a generation, from the late 1930s with depression and the approach of World War II, then the privations of war, then the intense confrontation of the Cold War, that this generation had experienced a shared epoch of public mobilization, public discipline. Albert Hirschman's brilliant essay, Shifting Involvement, argues that such commitments will disappoint in turn. Public rewards will stale, as will then private. By the 1960s, it was time for the young publics in both camps to press for an agenda of expressiveness and self-realization rather than the agenda of discipline. Such profound shifts cannot occur without excesses, both silly and cruel. 68, whether in Latin America, the West American and Western universities, or in the repressed challenges to communism, represented that global reaction to the intensely public agendas of 1933 to 1963. The groups in control of each system, however, were still too strong to be displaced by the protesters who sought to undermine this reciprocal dependence. That would happen to a degree in the West in the 1970s, at least the challenges of unions and women's groups, and in the East at the end of the 1980s, but it was only foreshadowed at most in the 60s. Meanwhile, the agents of history that beckoned were not the establishments, the East, the West, the orthodoxies, or the counter-orthodoxies. The movements that beckoned were the revolutionary peasantry, those summoned by Mao's Cultural Revolution, or those who had followed Che to the Andes, or were defeating the Americans in the Mekong Delta, and even, so the Tet Offensive suggested, in the once immune zones of Saigon. Yesterday, Jeffrey Herf repeated a widespread argument last year's in America that Tet was actually an FLN defeat and an American victory. That was misinterpreted by the media. But this argument, I think, misses the point. The stakes involved were not the number of casualties or even the permanent occupation of Vietnam cities, which the FLN could not do at this point, but the visible demonstration of American impotence to achieve what it claimed it could do and had done. Tet demonstrated that American power had not crushed the capacity of the FLN in Vietnam. It showed an alternative sort of struggle, as had Cuba and Algeria in the years before. The proximity in time of the Tet Offensive and the Prague Spring helps set out the significance of 1968 in global context, and lets us, in conclusion, understand why 1968 belongs to global history. Tet, in the eyes of those angered by the Vietnam War, supposedly struck at Western imperialism. The events of Prague Spring sought to dismantleize bureaucratized post-Stalinism. Both sets of events thus undermined the frozen Cold War equilibrium of forces that had been supposedly sealed by the Yalta agreements a generation earlier. Tet, as the Cuban Revolution earlier, was interpreted by the Western left not as preeminently a Marxist or even a Leninist event, but a challenge by the revolutionary ex-colonial world against the North. A South-North conflict, to use that shorthand, as well as a mutiny within the industrialized socialist world, revealed that what was at stake was the unavowed domination of a Soviet-American condominium. Think back to the Yalta agreements of February 1945, which of course are intensely studied here. To East Europeans, Yalta came to be seen as the founding act of a Soviet-American condominium or joint partnership for dominating East and West Europeans respectively. The visible signs of the Yalta system were the Western refusals to come to the aid of communist rebels, whom their statesmen had rashly encouraged to revolt, as in Berlin in 1953 and Hungary in 1956. But the East Europeans' reading of Yalta, this is George Conrad as well as others, it was a false one. It saw Yalta as a renewed version, to be crude, of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a collusive partition of Poland and East Central Europe as a whole. In fact, Yalta provided no easy condominium, no shared hegemony. It just introduced an era of massive confrontation that strained every national and ideological reflex on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Whatever the implications for East Central Europe, Yalta was not just a Soviet-American set of agreements to minimize their mutual disagreement and maximize their respective hegemonic aspirations. Yalta incorporated, remember, important clauses concerning Asia by which Stalin recognized Chiang Kai-shek's government in return for winning territorial concessions in China. In the eyes of the communist Chinese regime, Yalta thus followed in the steps of earlier unequal treaties and thus perpetuated what might be described as a North-South inequality. In 1968, thus represented a moment in which a new generation was effectively transforming an international politics dominated by East-West conflict and the respective elites that instrumentalized it, changing this into a North-South struggle. Logically enough, China, certainly no friend of the Czech reform course as such, found itself condemning Brezhnev's intervention and rediscovered its own vulnerability vis-à-vis the Soviet Union. This would lead over the years to come both to the curbing of the Cultural Revolution and to acceptance of Nixon's and Kissinger's courtship, ultimately, therefore, to China's own loss of radical charisma among once radical enthusiasts. By the early 1970s, the New Left would have to find its third world champions no longer in East Asia, but among Palestinians, black South Africans, and the Marxist liberation movements in the failing Portuguese colonies and the guerrilla movements of South America. Any huge event is pregnant with the future, especially when it catches up in it an age cohort that is poised on the edge of adulthood. No accident that 68 would send echoes down the years. Yet its importance, I believe, lay less in the ideas it created than its undermining of the competitive equilibria of the First Cold War. Marx thought 1848 and its French aftermath was farce, not tragedy. But he was wrong, in fact. The events of 1848 were not farce, but what Carl Schmitt termed political romanticism, the illusion that events might yield to ideological fantasy. And what the course of Europe was shaped by, however, were the revolutions from above a generation later. And not only Europe, whether in Meiji Japan, Cavour's Italy, Bismarck's Germany, Juarez's Mexico, post-Civil War America, the whole era of liberal-conservative compromise based on railroads and nation-building and capitalist industrialization. 1968, likewise, was a romantic outburst that could shake and undermine the Cold War order. But ultimately, it required a new era of technological change, of wealth and neo-capitalism to make its more general impulses feasible. Those who had been 68ers felt they had participated in something heroic, not just the acting out that enraged Raymond Aron. But they had to become the demonstrators of 1989 who eschewed violence and who negotiated the round tables. So perhaps, quote, "As ye sow, so shall ye reap," does serve as a guide to history. In any case, I think, I hope that we can see this movement in this sense as a closing act of some fantastic generation of public commitment, the age of ideological tension and of collective discipline, and the opening up to either you want to call it post-industrial, post-modern society. And it is with those reflections that I will close. Thank you.
I think we take a 10 minutes break and then resume.
You want to?
Questions?
Yeah, let's have questions.
Oh, we should take a question.
Charlie, okay?
Yeah, sure. I like questions. I much prefer them to reading papers. But
Thank you for a fascinating talk.
I'll go from left to right. I think that's...
Yeah, I just had a question. I mean, I love the way you framed your talk sort of around the issue of why these global protests were so widespread and what's the kind of commonality. But what your main conclusion, this kind of Soviet-U.S. world condominium, I myself see as more of an outcome of 1968 rather than a cause. I mean, and so I'm just wondering if you have any comments on that. I mean, I agree that our sort of traditional insistence on distinguishing the protests in the East and in the West allow us not only to sort of heroicize the Eastern European protesters in their sort of defiance of this big bad communist government, but they also, maybe just to be devil's advocate, allow us to avoid having to compare U.S. government actions with like Soviet government actions in sort of reimposing order. And what I do see when I kind of compare all these global upheavals myself is this sort of order versus liberation struggle transcending any kind of East-West ideological divide.
I mean, it's precisely the last. I meant to suggest more than Soviet-American condominium, symbolized by Yalta, was what crystallized a protest. That's part of it, but I wanted to place that in the whole notion that from the 30s through the 50s, most of our societies went through this period in which, in a sense, we were intensely politically mobilized. Look, everyone comes here with memories, and they talk unapologetically of them. So let me talk about the memories of the 50s in which I was a school kid. This is a period in which we lived the Cold War daily. We had, and not just because of McCarthyism, and not just because we had to stick our heads under the desk when the atomic flash came, but this was. The more I think of it as a historian, and perhaps as as someone who was a kid at that time, the intense, in a sense, I call it seismic pressure, like accumulates on the fault lines of the earth to mobilize societies first against fascism and publicly against private capitalism, or to overcome the faults of private capitalism, the 30s, against fascism, then against the mutual enemy. We created a world, I think, for a generation in which public agonistic relations claimed a huge amount of our energies, and in this sense, I think '68 reflects somehow the weakening of that possibility. That couldn't be maintained forever, and I think, but it didn't just gradually dissipate any more than the plates of the Earth just sort of ease out without creating shocks and shakes at various points. But it's not just Soviet Americanism. It's the whole issue of being in a sense hyper nationalized for a generation. Sultan.
Yeah, I wonder if I could press you a little further from the particular.
Sir, if you speak in the microphone.
From the particular to theory. You're quite the distance, but there are striking continuities, it seems to me, between sort of the 1968 et al. and at least intellectual tendencies in 1914 already. That is, I'm struck by Max Weber turning enthusiastically pro-violence as World War I starts, because the iron cage is imprisoned, right. And this is a way out. And the themes of anti-technocracy, anti-iron cage are obviously strong in '68. So why would you just say it's a revolt against the Yalta regime and not say?
I'm not saying that.
But the Yalta regime, and well, you called it that. I understand it's not just the U.S.-Soviet condominium, but it's the 50s. Why not say this is the then current version of the modernity that was already oppressive in 1914, and make that. I mean, you allude to that, but why not press that further?
Okay, look, the tensions are always present. By Yalta, I meant to express that there was a common interest, or a certain, that there was a common logic to these establishments, which in fact on both sides of the Iron Curtain felt they were moving toward, their intellectuals felt they were moving toward a de-ideologized, technocratic sort of rule, industrial society, cybernetics. I mean, even Ulbricht loved cybernetics for East Germany, and this is, and I have Soviet tracts on this. This notion that this was the joint enterprise underneath or at the same, coexisting with the conflict. So this is what I really meant, trying to look at the common logic of the nomenclature and the American governing classes. And about 1914, yes, I'm relieved you didn't tell me to think about the Rosicrucians in 1610, but because I don't know enough about and Rosicrucianism varies on Adam Weishaupt's weird notions of world conspiracy. It's always it's not anyway. 1940, but it's true about Weber. It's true about the whole generation of 1914. There's this French inquiry called by two students, taking the name of Agathon, and the students respond, better a war than this perpetual waiting. I think there's a generation of peace weariness. My notion is that every type of public regime over a generation does, and it's hard to document and impose certain, in a sense, psychic costs, create psychic revolts. And in 1914, so to speak, Max Weber and the German students who went off to Langemarck, and the British students who went off to Ypres, and the French who would go off eventually to Verdun and elsewhere. This catharsis came with this terrible war, but had it not come with this terrible war, you did see a huge outburst of anarcho-syndicalist agitation between 1910 and 1914. In the English Triple Alliance, in the Irish agitation, you saw a crescendo of nationalist movements, not just in Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans, but in Ireland and elsewhere. So that this was building. You could have had, in effect, a type of 68 had you not had 1914. But, I won't say we had the good fortune to have 1914, but we had something different. And what's ironic is that what we get sometimes mobilizes individuals more than they both want to be demobilized and mobilized. I can't go, I'd have to think this through, but I'm not. Your scenario is a plausible one, and I think it's World War I in effect that fulfills these aspirations and at the same time channels them in different directions. Okay.
Could I just briefly remark? I'm kind of disturbed that a new paradigm is emerging where the fundamental differences between the protest in the communist East and in the West are being papered over. There was a fundamental difference between Dutschke and Adam Michnik, not to mention between Sakharov and Cohn-Bendit, in the fact that on one side in the East they were reacting to the utopia that failed, in the West they were seeking to create a new utopia on the basis of maybe boring but pragmatic societies. I would like to hear your reaction on what Tony Judd wrote in post-war on the total inability of protesters in the West and in the East to understand each other. It looked like the two trains moving in the opposite direction. Thank you.
Look, I'm not equating these people. Michnik tunes into the East at a different point in his life. This is Berman's point. We explain these differences by a sort of life trajectory theory in which we look at the different points at which our biographies are as the trains of history go by, and that, in a sense, is the way we reconcile them. That we all know, until at least Alzheimer's overtakes us, that we have identities that are based on memory and experience and the like, and that's this is the way we build. I think he's built a certain redemptive history so that what seems the ugly aspects of 68 in the West are, in a sense, can be redeemed. So Joschka Fischer, whom we see in the pictures, you know, in his riot gear battling with cops, will become the Joschka Fischer who wants to make Germany a responsible actor in the Balkans, etc. So this is there. I'm not saying that these are identical, and I don't think. Yes, they misunderstood each other, but I'm saying that we don't look. If we're going to do more than what I call phenomenological history, and I believe in doing more, but others may differ, I don't think we can go by just the statements of the actors. I don't think we can go by their intentionality. This was mentioned yesterday. There are, you know, situations in historical logics that take people up so they are acting in causes differently from what they think they are. And this may, you know, this may come out or this may not come out. So I'm less concerned with what Duška says and Michnik. There's absolutely no effort to compare. I think Michnik and others like him will grow down as heroes of the 20th century. And I don't think, you know, and I think Duška's logic is very flawed. Come on, Vidal-Naquet was right. CRS did not equal SS. West Germany was not becoming fascist. The notion of structural violence, of structural fascism, is, I just want to show its hypnotic power in this period. Not that it was real. We know the difference, and this is what those of us who were young teachers at this time were trying to tell students at the time. Come on, you know, you may like studying about Barcelona. This is not Barcelona. This is, and I think. So I don't really think that this is true. Now, as for Tony Judt, my impression, and this is I think a fantastic achievement, this book, but I would never call a book on the whole period up into the early 21st century post-war. To me, what's interesting about 68 is this is where the post-war ends. Because and even more than the post-war, and that what somehow begins in the 70s, 80s, and goes on is a type of caesura, a new epoch, which is opening up on the basis of different technologies, a huge technological revolution, which we. We know about from our cell phones and our computers, a huge a change in the disappearance, as Andre Gortz said, of the heroic Western working class, etc. So I don't think post-war adequately covers this. Post-war, to put it crudely, ended in 68, and post-war began. Okay, and that's all I can say.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Well.